Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kelly O'Donnell in Washington, and we begin with an abrupt change in course from President Trump tied to the war against Iran, and a top administration official resigning his post over the president's decision to go to war. After lashing out at NATO allies for rejecting his demands to help the U.S. reopen the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump is now saying the U.S. does not need any help and that it never needed any help, despite just yesterday saying that numerous countries were on the way to assist in the strait. During a meeting with the Irish Taoiseach, the prime minister, today, President Trump doubling down on not needing other countries while chiding NATO.
We don't need help. You know, that war has been long prosecuted as far as I'm concerned, almost from day one. We knocked out many of these things. We knocked out the Navy essentially in a couple of days. I think NATO's making a very foolish mistake, and I've long said that, you know, I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. So this was a great test, because we don't need them, but they should have been there.
The president's comments come after his economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, said this morning that some oil tankers are starting to move through the strait.
The bottom line is that the timeline that President Trump has stated over and over is that it's a 4 to 6 week war, and that we're ahead of schedule. And so already you're seeing tankers are starting to dribble through the straits. And I think it's a sign of how little Iran has left. Iran's strategy appeared to be that they could hurt the U.S. economy, and then that would make President Trump slow down. In fact, they're not hurting the U.S. economy very much at all. While gas prices are higher, the economy as a whole is sound. And there's no way that President Trump's going to back down until he sees this through to the end.
We're watching new data from the group Marine Traffic that monitors movement of vessels around the world. And that shows a few ships have been able to pass through the strait. But they're mostly cargo vessels, not oil tankers. As for what comes next in the war, President Trump was pressed today on the possibility of U.S. boots on the ground and his day-after plan. Here's some of what he had to say.
As the Iranian regime has told Sky News, if you put boots on the ground in Iran, it will be another Vietnam. Are you afraid of that?
No, I'm really not afraid of anything.
Iran is just a military operation to you, but do you not have a day after plan? And if so, what is your day after plan for Iran?
Well, we have a lot. Look, if we left right now, it would take 10 years for them to rebuild. But we're not ready to leave yet. But we'll be leaving in the near future. We'll be leaving in pretty much the very near future.
The very near future, he says. Meanwhile, a sign of potential fracturing inside the White House and administration. Today, the director of National Counterterrorism Center and longtime supporter of the president, Joe Kent, announcing his resignation, writing on social media, quote, "I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby." President Trump and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt both pushing back, arguing that Iran's potential pursuit of a nuclear weapon was an imminent threat. On the ground, military strikes continue to escalate. This was the scene in Iraq as an Iran-aligned militia group fired at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. A fireball, an explosion seen after one projectile got through the U.S. defenses, striking the compound. And today, Israel says it killed Iran's top security official and vowed to continue to pursue Iran's leadership. Joining me now for a conversation are NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez, who's in Beirut today, and Ken Pollack, vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute and a former CIA military analyst. Monica, let me start with you. The president is now claiming the U.S. does not need help securing the Strait of Hormuz, very different than what we were hearing from him yesterday. What changed?
Yeah, just 24 hours ago, Kelly, we were talking about the president making this overture, saying that he had reached out to various countries. He even claimed that several of them were enthusiastic about helping the United States potentially with this issue. And now today, a total 180 where the president is saying, actually, no, he didn't feel like he ever needed the help of other countries, including the NATO allies of the United States, and that he doesn't want their help, that he doesn't even want to consider it, and that he now rejects it after they, in fact, rejected this question of perhaps determining whether they were going to aid in all of this. So the president now continuing to essentially demean the NATO alliance, to make false statements about what he says is NATO's inability to help the United States in a moment of need, when, of course, NATO did come to the aid of the United States after the 9/11 attacks, when Article 5 was invoked. And, Kelly, the president after that making another headline on something that we were discussing yesterday on the show, which is the president saying he will delay his trip to China, which is related to all of this as the ongoing conflict stretches on in Iran and those strikes continue. The president says he feels he needs to be here, and so he isn't going to be traveling to Beijing like he was planning to in a couple of weeks, saying instead that is now going to get pushed back 5 or 6 weeks, though no new date has been set yet. Kelly.
And as we mentioned, Monica, there's a change in the director of the National Counterterrorism Center announcing he's resigning, and he cited the war with Iran. And so what more do we know about this decision? And Joe Kent is controversial in some ways as well. So how is the White House reacting to this?
Yeah, and he, in this letter, obviously made his main point about the ongoing war against Iran, saying that that's why he couldn't serve anymore. And it opens up the question about whether there could be other senior Trump administration officials who feel similarly, who might make a similar exit. But the White House is responding pretty intensely and emphatically that they reject his claim that there wasn't an imminent threat. And remember, this is what Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, and President Trump have been trying to argue since the beginning of this military conflict, that they believe that there was this imminent threat, though at times they have defined that in different terms. But you do bring up that Joe Kent certainly is a controversial figure. He has aligned himself with some far-right figures. He has been accused of anti-Semitism and of election denialism. And so right now you are seeing a White House that is trying to paint him in a light, the president himself saying that he believed that Joe Kent was weak on security, which prompts a whole nother round of questions of why, if they believed he wasn't the right person to lead on this, he was still leading the National Counterterrorism Center at a really critical moment. Kelly.
That is a curious statement from the president to give him that criticism. We also heard something that has puzzled many of us yesterday when the president raised eyebrows more than once. He told reporters that he had spoken to a former president about the decisions he's made in Iran. Here's part of what the president said yesterday.
I've spoken to a certain president who I like, actually, a past president, former president. He said, I wish I did it. I wish I did, but they didn't do it. I spoke to one of the former presidents who I actually like. I actually speak to some. I do like some people, be shocking. And he said, I wish I did what you did.
I just want to ask you about something very interesting that you said twice today, that you talked to another former president about the Iran strikes. Was it George W. Bush?
No.
Was it Bill Clinton?
I don't want to say.
It was so curious because he was so specific in what he was describing. And you and I worked together on this, checking with the offices of all the former presidents. And what we heard again and again and again and again was that there is no such conversation that they would acknowledge between the current president and any of our living former presidents. So do we have any more clarity today on who he might have spoken to or where this came from?
We do not know, Kelly, and you're right. We checked with everybody, including the office of George W. Bush, and it was the president who said no, it wasn't him. We checked with, of course, former President Bill Clinton's office. There was some speculation that it may have been him because the president was making comments that this was somebody that he likes and who may like him. His office said nope. And the same thing for the office of former President Barack Obama and former President Joe Biden. We asked the White House for more details on who this might have been. They did not provide any additional information. Kelly.
It had me going down the rabbit hole. Thank you, Monica. We appreciate that. I want to bring Courtney into our conversation now. And he says that the U.S. could leave within a matter of weeks. Is that realistic in your judgment based on all the sources you're talking to? And what does that look like? Can you go in and bomb a lot of things and then just pull out?
Sure, you can. And the president can do anything that he wants. Now, it's going to leave a path of destruction. And that would they have actually made a lot of progress when it comes to taking out a lot of the Iranian military, particularly their Navy. They have taken out a lot of it. Their Air Force, their missile program. And what's critical is they're going after the production, not just the storage facilities. And the drones. drones, but they have not decimated or taken out all of their capability in any of those areas. Now, if the president were to say, I'm done, I want out, it's not just that Iran could potentially reconstitute. There's still the question of the regime. It may not be any different than the regime that has been in place now for years. So there may not be any change.
New people, but same ideas.
Precisely. And then the big question is the nuclear program. It still exists. They still have highly enriched uranium. They still have the know-how. They still have facilities. They may be damaged and some underground, but they still have them. So you would be leaving a hurt and damaged Iran, but they would not be down and out. They would still potentially present a threat, maybe delayed, but a threat.
Do you get any sense from the sources you're talking to that they would keep forces or resources positioned in the region in greater numbers than in peacetime, for example?
They could. I mean, just looking at the op tempo of President Trump, he is moving around and around and around. There was Iran in June, then there was Venezuela, and it moving people all over. So I can't envision a scenario where there's going to be any large presence in one area for a long period of time. That being said, if they've taken out a lot of Iran's capabilities, that in and of itself makes it harder for Iran the military calls it projecting power. What you and I know it as, makes it harder for them to attack outside because there's the potential they could always be hit back. No matter what, the normal presence for the U.S. in Central Command is like 35,000 troops, tons of air assets, ships. They would have the ability to go back and strike again if they wanted to.
And briefly, do we have the capacity, the United States have the capacity to protect the Strait of Hormuz without these other nations coming to the U.S. aid?
The U.S. has the ability, but it is extremely dangerous right now. So until they have taken out more of the drone threat specifically, but also some surface-to-surface missiles, and then the mines. They still have mines. There's no indication that they're laying any of them yet, but they could. So all of that, just having it, they don't even have to use them routinely. They just have to have them, and that threat alone threatens commercial shipping, and that is why the Strait of Hormuz has become such a problem in recent days.
Appreciate your expertise. You are on every incremental piece of this. Thank you so much. And Raf, let me bring you into the conversation. I know you've moved into Lebanon now, where that, of course, is the country there is experiencing a lot of this, the regional fallout. So today, Israel talks about killing the top security official as well as the head of their paramilitary force that Iran has used to quell protests. That's been a substantial issue there. What more do we know about these strikes, and what's the reaction?
So, Kelly, Israel says these were targeted strikes and that they took out a man called Ali Larijani. Now, his official title was Secretary of the National Security Council, but that doesn't really capture the scope of his power. Larijani was effectively the de facto wartime leader of Iran. Israel, of course, killed the former supreme leader in the opening hours of the war, the current supreme leader wounded, and so it was Larijani who was taking a lot of the day-to-day decisions inside of the regime. Israel says he is now dead. We haven't had confirmation of that from the Iranian government. Interestingly, Larijani's Twitter account has been active in the last couple of hours. They posted what they said was a handwritten letter from him expressing condolences to the families of Iranian sailors who were killed. That, of course, is not proof that he is alive. And, Kelly, what's interesting is Larijani's name had been floated as a potential Delcy Rodriguez figure, if you will, in Iran, somebody inside of the regime, but who potentially the Trump administration could do business with. He is now dead, according to Israel. He's not going to be able to play that role. The other figure taken out was the head of the Basij. This is the regime's militia force that it uses for a lot of its internal repression in Iran. So when those protesters were on the streets back in January, it was the Basij militia, often with weapons, who were sent onto the street to confront them. And the fact that Israel targeted this individual suggests that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is still holding on to some hope that Iranian protesters might go back to the streets and might try to overthrow the regime. Kelly.
The Delcy Rodriguez reference, of course, is Venezuela, and there are those potential parallels here. Let me ask you to put sort of your European coverage hat back on and say that NATO countries, we understand, convened in Brussels today to discuss what's been going on with the war in Iran. And it comes after President Trump has really been critical of that alliance and says he no longer needs their help, not getting out of NATO, but doesn't want their help. What has the reaction been among the NATO alliance?
So it's really interesting, Kelly. These European diplomats speaking in about as blunt terms as diplomats ever speak, basically saying that this is America's war, the U.S. started it, and it's up to the U.S. to figure out how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. We are hearing from one of the top European Union officials just saying there's no appetite from Europe to get involved here. They are not involved in striking Iran directly. They weren't consulted by President Trump before the U.S. and Israel began striking Iran. And they see the best way of getting the straits reopened is for there to be an end to the war. So they are making pretty clear at this point that they are not planning on sending ships. The president has been expressing his frustration both in that pool spray in the Oval Office and on Truth Social. But for now, the Europeans seem pretty clear that they're not getting mixed up in this. Kelly.
And that tension is palpable. Thank you so much, Raf. I'm going to turn now to Ken and bring you into this conversation. The president says the U.S. has been in negotiations with Iran, but he has also said he's not clear on who the leader is now after the death of the Ayatollah and questionable status of his son. So if most of the leadership has been in one way or another killed, who is in charge, and is there a deal to be made?
So I think that the easiest way to answer that question, Kelly, is to say that the people in charge in Tehran are the Revolutionary Guard leadership. Right? It is very clear that they're the ones running the show. I thought that Raf made a very good point that Ali Larijani was always considered not necessarily a moderate, but certainly a pragmatist. And it reflected Ayatollah Khamenei's position, which was ultimately one of restraint when fighting the United States. He's now gone, right? And he was the biggest voice in Iran arguing for a more moderate approach to this entire war. And I think that's important, Kelly, because to go back to points that Courtney was making beforehand, you know, one of the real risks that the United States faces now that we've killed Ayatollah Khamenei and now Ali Larijani as well, Israelis have killed him, it's not clear that the Iranians are going to stop fighting. You know, the president may decide he's had enough, he's going to end the war. The Iranians may keep shooting. They may keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. They may keep firing at our allies. They may keep firing at Israel. And I think that the president already recognizes that that's going to be a dilemma for him. I think that's why he struck Karg Island a few days ago and threatened the Iranians that if they didn't reopen the strait, that he'd strike the oil facilities on Karg Island.
That's very helpful to give us some sense of how you see this. And the president says the U.S. could be leaving the region in the near future. And if he is to do that, if he decides he's met his objectives and pulls out, what do you think the fallout would be in the region after the U.S. ceases military operations?
Right. Well, again, the first question is, if the U.S. stops, do the Iranians stop? Because if the Iranians don't stop, it's going to be very hard for the U.S. to leave the region. We're not going to be able to walk away from our allies, and we're certainly not going to be able to walk away from the Strait of Hormuz if oil isn't flowing through it. So as I said, the first problem is that. Second, even if somehow we can get to this negotiated settlement, the region is going to be a very unstable one as long as this Iranian regime is in place. Right? Let's recognize this was always an enemy to our allies throughout the region. They hated and feared this regime. We've now eliminated the supreme leader, who, as I said before, was actually something of a voice of restraint within their system. It is now very much under the control of much more aggressive, much more belligerent anti-American leaders within the Revolutionary Guard. And if Mustafa Khamenei is alive, what we know most about him is that he is very much in the pocket of the Revolutionary Guard. So he's likely to pursue a policy that's going to be inimical to their interests, threaten them to an even greater extent. It's going to be an angry regime. And quite frankly, it's going to be a regime that probably is going to believe that it has to have nuclear weapons, because the only way to deter future American and Israeli attacks will be if they have nuclear weapons.
And the whole point initially was to deal with the president's view that they need to not have nuclear weapons. So the circle that you just drew is certainly a lot to consider. Ken Pollack, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and expertise today.
My pleasure.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.